Okay, so we left off talking about archaic Greek sculpture. And we were looking in the 7th century at how these Koros, young boy, and Kore, young girl, young woman, how these figures replaced those large geometric pots, let me finish my sentence, as grave markers, right? That's where we left off, as grave markers, okay? And how these works show a great indebtedness to Egyptian art, right? And that's because it seems as if it was contact with Egypt in the 7th century BC, right, the 600s, that actually inspires the Greeks to turn to large-scale sculpture. And what we'll find is that that's also true for architecture. They start to build in stone at exactly the same time because they come into contact with the Egyptians, right, who inspired them to build permanent stone buildings as well. So these replaced earlier thatch and wood buildings. Suing. I did hit record. Thank you. But I'm surprisingly ahead of you in this case. What we see is that the earliest of these sculptures in the 7th century end up being somewhat schematized. And we were looking at that. There's some realism to them, but there's also some things that are kind of unrealistic. And in particular, they, you know what I mean when I say schematize, it's sort of simplify, right? Instead of showing all the detail, they show the broad strokes. You think about a wiring diagram for, there's probably a lost reference, right? I fix things. And when you look at a wiring diagram, it doesn't look like, say, what the stove looks like or your car. It just has a line because it's schematized and where it says starts here and ends there. That's all you need to know, right? And these two have also been schematized to the broader strokes. So the face is simplified, the body is simplified. And sometimes the proportions are a little screwy still, like her hand, right? Monster hand that she has. Man hands, Seinfeld called them once, right? And her other hand seems to come all the way down to her kneecap, you know? So there's little bits that just don't work. And what we're going to see as we look at archaic Greek sculpture, and we're going to look at like one more example to begin with, is that as we move forward in time, from 600 to 500, the figures get more realistic. The proportions get better. The sense of naturalism, the sense that it actually looks like something you might actually see, gets stronger, right? And so with our Koros figure on the left, while there are quite a bit of realism, there's still that weird sort of, it's like he's wearing a pair of slacks instead of legs, you know? He's got that crease that runs down the shin bone. That looks more like a pressed pair of trousers almost. Or the way in which the line underneath his pectoral muscle, or that outlines his rib cage, has become sort of a single line, right? That's simplified into something that looks like the arc in St. Louis over the top of his rib cage, right? Or like the way you used to draw birds in the sky when you were a kid, you know, just simple circles underneath his pectorals, right? It's based on observation, but it's not particularly detailed and realistic in itself. Okay, I thought I'd gotten rid of that. Well, there we are. Okay, as we move our way through the course of the 6th century, through the 500s, you can see that while the hand is still kind of extraordinarily large here, the figure someone, he was standing like this, we think, right? So it's still a Koros figure with a slightly different pose. So rather than down like there's at least one hand, and probably both, so you can see on this stick over here, there's that broken bit, right? That he was probably standing like that. But even though the hand is extraordinarily thick-fingered, right, and big-looking, you can see that the treatment of the muscles has lost that segmentation. Many years sort of delineation we're seeing with this earlier figure. And 100 years later, the transitions between the muscles are smoother. And especially, I think, apparent down here below, you know, the abdominals, where they translate to his hips, there's sort of a smooth transition between those muscle groups. In the fact that they're actually understanding muscle groups as part of a unified whole rather than as independent units that are sort of, you know, stuck together, right? the sense of realism, the sense of naturalism is becoming stronger. If we go back to your textbook again, and again from around the same period as this Kurose figure from the Walters in Baltimore, we see one of the same codes that we've seen before. This one marks the grave of a soldier named Croesus. Now, it's not meant to be a portrait, right? None of these grave markers are meant to be portraits. They're just male grave markers on a male grave. But it certainly isn't. We shouldn't think that he is Croesus. But he was found marking the grave of someone named Croesus. And so that's how we delineate him or distinguish him from all those other Kurose figures. This is the Kurose of Croesus. Or save yourself from writing Croesus. But it's not a portrait. Still in exactly the same pose that we saw before. But again, the sense of muscle understanding as groups has also improved dramatically. Some of the proportions are still off. He was sort of built like a speed skater. Look at the size of his thighs, right? Or like a linebacker. I guess Super Bowl Sunday, like a linebacker. He's got a lot of strength sort of through here, right, through his hips and his thighs, and they're much heavier looking. But you'll notice that the way the body seems to work together almost seems as if it's caught in the sense of sort of shifting weight. Even though he's standing flat-footed, there's a sense that the body moves, and when one part of the body moves, the rest of the body has to adjust that. And I think it's particularly true down here in the leg where we've lost that sense of creasing that the shins made before. But also I think the sort of subtlety, the way that the body, the muscles of the abdominal here, and off the side of who's in health professionals, I don't know what that muscle is called. The love handle. Right? And no, I took anatomy and physiology as an undergrad, but I can't remember why I can't remember my muscle now. Worst test I ever had to take was the AMT muscle test. My God, it's horrible. Like, I studied my ass off, still got it. Right? Because you have to learn origin, insertion, and action. I didn't know where the muscles started. Every muscle in the body, and then there's a bone in the bag. You know, like only feel the bone and then figure out where it was. Well, I don't remember that muscle's called. But it's handled really nicely, it kind of smoothly, compared to what we had seen before. And that's indicative of this move through the course of the 500s, right, from 600 to 500 BC. That's indicative of this move toward greater understanding of muscles as being part of homeostatic machine, right, where everything works in relation to everything else. Right? And if you see him from the side, we can also see that the sense of movement is a little bit better too. He's walking forward in the manner of the Greeks still somewhat flat-footed, but there's a sense of a weight shift and a balance that's achieved between the closing of the weight on either side. And again, the torso has that sense that the pectorals are in fact related to the abdominals and to the muscles along the sides as well. Now his arms pulled back a bit as he strides forward. But I think the quads have been modeled in a way on his thighs that look really quite convincing, much more so than what we saw to begin with as our first slide this evening. So there's an attempt to give him a greater sense of vibrancy, of liveliness, of life-like nature that we see as we work our way through archaic Greek sculpture. The only part that doesn't work so well is his face. And you'll notice he looks sort of like he has a thyroid problem with his eyes. He's going to bug out, you know. I always think it's like Mr. Potato Head. You ever play with Mr. Potato Head when you were a kid? They just stick these features on the outside of the potato, and they would always sit on the outside. They never sat in the eye sockets, right? And his eyes are kind of like that. They're sort of coming out so that they're flush with his eyebrow and his cheeks down below. And he's got that weird smile, which we find a lot in later archaic Greek sculpture. And we think it's one of their attempts to try to add a certain inner life to the sculpted figure. Now, it's not like the Egyptians where they thought that the soul was going to live here, right? It's not a residency for the soul. Nor does it have any real life to it, like, for example, those statuettes from Samaria, where the surrogate is always wide awake and calculated and angry, right? But there is an attempt to try to make the figure closer to life. And one of the attempts to give it life, and it's a bit schematic interesting is this idea of what we call the arts to make smile, that we find all over the place, even in the most extraordinary circumstances. One of the things you'll see on one of the online things is a dying warrior from the facade of a Greek temple. He's falling down, he's trying to pull the spear out of his side, and he's humble and tears, and he's smiling because he's still alive. And it's that use of the archaic smile that we find often in sculptures from the 500s, right? But you'll notice the interesting details when it comes to, for example, the curls of his hair held back by that headband, right? Held back by that headband. Actually, it's kind of a skull cap, isn't it? But there's a greater interest in sort of particularizing out the details. Now, for the rest of tonight, we're going to look at pots. Because I think Greek pottery gives us this great opportunity not only to look at this amazing output of pottery, this thing that we'll see, and by the way, this one's in Rome on the right. We'll have a chance to look at that. I think it might be on somebody's wrist. Somebody's going to get lucky if we're talking about this, right? But pottery, Greek pottery, which is one of the major outputs of the archaic Greek period and beyond, gives us a great opportunity to talk quite a bit about Greek culture and different elements, particularly the mythologies that were a major part of the Greek understanding of the world. Because for the Greeks, the gods and the myths so intertwined with daily life that there's overlaps, and their mythology is almost invariably about living, about what it means to be alive. And so this gives us a great opportunity to sort of talk about that intersection between the physical world and the supernatural world that the Greeks took so much stock in, but also, I think, this idea of a very human art. And I think, why do we still talk about Greek culture from the ancient period when it's 2,500 years old, and what does it have to do with us today? You're dealing with humanism. And I mean that if there's ever been a negative word to it, I mean it's like, what do we as humans have in common? And we can look through these myths to find these sort of truths about what does it mean to really be alive? What does it mean to understand our emotions and our relationships with each other and with the community as a whole? These are lessons that are there to be found and make this stuff, I think, relevant beyond being sort of just stunningly beautiful in its way as well. So we're looking at pots for quite a while. Certainly not as much as we could, because we're going to see opportunities in literally hundreds, maybe thousands. Let's pick and choose, just too many to look at in Rome in the museums we're going to. So I've sort of pared it down. I'm not going to show you everything we're going to see in the museum either, but there's a lot out there. That's a major production, and a lot of these were made for export to Italy, wound up in Italian collection. So, that said, Exekias is one of the most famous archaic Greek potters. And he's not only a potter, he's also the pot painter. When it came to Greek pots, when we have records, people who signed them, for example, this one's signed, I'll show you the signatures in a second. We know that the potting industry was sometimes broken up where one person would throw the pot and someone else would paint it. But oftentimes, some of the master potters did both. And Exekias falls into that. Right? And when they find the pots, this is always very fascinating, it speaks to you. The pot says, Exekias painted me. Exekias potted or threw me on the wheel and painted me, made me and painted me. And I've always just found that kind of fascinating, that the pot's kind of dialoguing with you, because we often talk about art picking up its meaning when we have a dialogue with it. Right? Because it does give us back things, and not all at once, right? When we go back and look at it again, we might see something different, because it's speaking to us in a different way. And this pot speaks to us quite literally. The words on it speak to us. Now, in the course of the 500s, the 6th century BC, we see pots fall into two basic categories. And this is chronological. The earlier ones have black figures against a red ground. Okay? And this is the tradition that was established back with these geometric pots, where we see the figures are these darkened silhouettes against the red ground that is the color of the pot itself, right? The color of the terracotta. And historians have just labeled this black figure. So for those of you that might have one of these, for example, on your list of slides for works of art for your resident expertness, it's been a long day already. I sat all the way through a vacuuming, carving one of those little things, and it was such a boring meeting. We call it black figure because quite obviously the figures are black. What we'll find is that by the end of the 6th century, by around 500 or so, this gives way to red figure, which are, the figures are red, the red of the pottery, and the background is painted black, right? So these are two primary kinds of base painting. And the way in which the black figure is made, and I think I talked about this a bit when we looked at these old funerary pots, is that the glazing, and it appears to be glazed, but it's not. Glazing is where you actually take ground-up glass and you immerse it in a medium, suspend it, right, in a liquid, and you paint it on, and then you put it in the kiln a second time after the pot's been fired, and the glass speckles that are in there turn into glass again, right? And so there's a color to change the color. But that's not what they're doing, because you need a certain level of heat in order to do that. And what I read is they didn't have it hot enough yet, which I don't understand because they were melting bronze. Why couldn't you do that? But that's what I read. Okay. What they used instead was they would grind up some iron into thinned out clay, what's called slip. You guys ever make pots in high school? Right? Slip's the stuff you make to, keep the slabs of pottery together, right? And you can thin it way out so that it's just like, really, really thin mud. Right? Like the Potomac River. Okay? Yeah. It's just suspended clay, thin suspended clay in water. Right? And if you added into the slip certain elements, certain metals, then when it got heated up again, it would change color. And iron has a tendency of turning black. Think of a cast iron skillet, right? My favorite thing in the kitchen is my cast iron skillet, because I treated it really well and it's non-stick. But it is black as the blackest thing I own, right? It is dark pitch black. And iron oxide in the slip will turn black like this. And what they've done is they've added that onto the outside of the pot, right? And I've got to be here, just detail. Oh no, okay, that details to show you black figure. They've added it to the outside of the pot. And then once it comes out of the kiln, they've burnished it with a stone or a spoon, and that gives it the glaze-like quality, right? That's why it looks so darn shiny, is because you can then polish it. It's just like you can polish a stone with your hand, right, if you rub it long enough. Or if you've ever had a rock polisher, you just stick it in a thing and shake it up and they all get polished, right? From just rubbing against each other. That's what they do. Okay? So that's how black figure is made. It's put onto the pot, sometimes with a brush, sometimes with a syringe. So they sort of have like imagine you're going to put frosting on a cake. You put a tube, you squeeze it through a very thin bit, and it'll go along that way. That's how they made the detail of the border, for example, which has the detail coming up. And you'll see it's incredibly detailed, which is exactly what we saw happening when we talked about the Kuros figures, as they went from 600 to 500. They got more realistic, right? Well, look at these figures compared to those ones. And you can see that while they still have pinched waist, big thighs, tiny little feet, the same figures we see here, right? They're very similar figure outline, but look at how much more detail there is now. They've again progressed in that same direction. Okay? So this might be considered black figure as well, but they're not as highly polished as they are in the archaic period, later archaic period. Right? But you can see that the figure of sound is similar. I also wanted you to notice here that this is a scene of two warriors. Achilles and Ajax are in the middle of a war, but they've taken a break to play a game of dice. And they put their shields behind them. And can you see them just behind their hips on either side, what the shield looks like? Okay. there's the detail of the shield on the right, and you can see that it's the basic outline that's become this apple core guy that we're seeing in the earlier one, right? So this shield curves like this, and you hold it from the back, and that has given this artist this really geometricized version of that. So here's Ajax on the right, who hung up his helmet. Highly decorated shield, you can see this. Right, other details on that. And also everything is displayed to us in text. Right? So, in a nutshell, this is what black figure is. And let me see, there's another of these shields as well, right? Seen from the front rather than from the side. And there you can see how it ends up sort of being schematized to this in the earlier period. But we're getting much more realistic. Right. So here's our image for technique, and I don't know if you can tell or not, but it's been put on with a series of beads, like I said, it's a syringe, in order to give us that really detailed pattern that forms the border of the top and on the handles as well. And we'll see some other details of this, but often these are small little beads that are raised up on the surface as well. This is really what it's best preserved. It's a gorgeous pot. I would thought it'd be a fun project to get together with Joe down in the ceramics studio to have you guys like try to make a Greek pot, you know, and try to paint it. But I made a pot, maybe a little one, and then try to paint something on it. You know, try to come up with a design. It would be kind of fun. We could help you by giving you something to work from. Right? For a sense of the detail that we have, now we're looking at this as Achilles on the left, and look at all these amazing details on his robe, right? Where what they've done is after you lay down the slit, right before you send it back into the kiln to be fired and hardened, you can scratch back through it with a needle point, right? And so all the designs here have been sort of scratched out. You ever use scratch pads for art projects, you know, where you lay some colors down and cover up with black crayon and you come back and scratch through it, right? And you feel what it is. That's exactly what's happening here. And you can see that the details are really quite spectacular and very refined. And you also get a sense for how that slip has been polished because this is the picture I took. That's the reflection on it, right? This unprofessional reflection actually has a pedagogical use here in that it shows us how this has been so very highly burnished. And the background has as well, some of that burnishing is chipped away. But it gives us that sense of real highly decorative elements which are part of the black figure, right? Theirs is a signature just behind Achilles. Exekius, right? Made me is what it says. And so it's identified there directly against it. Exekius made me and painted me is what it says. So he's one of our potters who did both. Now, we see with Greek vase painting in the later Archaic period a proliferation of these mythological scenes. Those early ones that we looked at, those funerary vases, those burial markers, were processions of deceased people, right? They related to the people who were buried there. But we see that once they moved from being burial vases to being utilitarian vases, we see that being replaced now with mythological scenes, well-known mythological scenes. And one of the things in looking at these that we have to remind ourselves is that any Greek looking at these would have known this myth inside out, right? When they see Achilles and Ajax, they wouldn't need somebody sitting in front of them at a podium to explain to them what was going on. They would have, and the words on it help, as well to identify it. But they would have known right away not only what was going on here, but what led up to this scene and what happened afterwards. They would have known all of that. That was the common knowledge. I can't think of a good narrative that we all know, right? Because our society is so fractured. All the things I know. When you see Bart Simpson, do you have to be told who he is, what it's all about? It's just like, okay, there's the Bratton family. That's that, right? We know what Homer's like, right? You guys still watch The Simpsons? You see, it's losing it, isn't it? Right? I can't think of something that we all know. Sorry?
Like
fairy tales. Yeah, there you go. Excellent. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, right? You kind of know I don't even know the broad outlines of that, except they hypo off to work, you know? Yeah, but there are certain things where we have the broad outlines, right? So they would have known this like the back of their hand, right? There would be no explanation necessary for them. But, you know, we're in the 21st century, and we kind of need that to know what's going on, right? But what's interesting about these mythological scenes in the hands of these artists is the degree to which they emphasize these human elements I've talked about before. Okay? These are really very much about human interaction and drama. And they profit from the fact that people knew these so very, very well. So the story here comes from the Iliad by Homer, one of the two great epic poems of early Greek civilization. Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Odyssey is all about Ulysses trying to get back home. Odysseus trying to get back home across the Mediterranean. The Iliad is all about the siege on Troy, right? The Greek siege on the city of Troy, okay? And during the siege of Troy, which lasted something like 7 years, right? The two great Greek heroes, Achilles and Ajax, who were best of friends, and in fact, people would know this. These guys are as good of friends as they could possibly be. They would also know what we all know about it. What do you know about Achilles? His heel. What do you know about his heel? Sorry? His one weakness, right? Because his mother dipped him in this pond that, was it his pond? Yeah. Okay. For that, I don't care. If somebody dipped him in a pond, right? Thank you for adding that. Holding him by his heel, that means he couldn't be hurt, right? He was impervious to spears everywhere but his heel. Okay? And people would have known that. But he's one of the two great heroes on the Greek side fighting against Troy. Ajax is his best friend, right? And during the 7-year siege of Troy, which obviously doesn't last 24/7, right? They take a little break to play a game, to pass the time. Okay? And that's what we're seeing here. So they lay their shields aside. Achilles has kicked his helmet back on the back of his head, right? Wearing it back here. So like a motorcycle rider stopping at the 7-Eleven, you know, rather than taking all the way off. And Ajax is taking all the way off and laid it behind him. They still got their spears, right? They're still ready for action, if you will, but their shields are there to show that they've taken the time off. The story, and this is what everyone would have known, was that they get so wrapped up in the game that when the call-up comes to go to war, they miss the call-up, right? So there's a moral here about, like, a time and a place for everything, and hey, you know, turn off your Facebook for a bit and do your homework, right? There's a time and a place for everything. So that's what they're doing here, is they're in the middle of this game, and people looking at this would have known immediately exactly what's going on. So that's some nice details here. There's the game itself. And you can see their hands, they're actually picking up the dice that they've thrown down. So they're chucking the dice down on the table, and they're seeing what comes up on the face of the dice, and there you can see it, right? Actually picking up the dice off of the table, and they're calling from their mouths are the scores. Tessera is 4, and the other one's saying Tria, 3. So it's a stupid game, right? 4 is 3. It's like playing war, right? My age feature here. There's no like strategy. It's like it's just literally wasting time. Throwing 2 dice down, see who's got the better score. Ha ha, I win, right? And then nobody gains there. But these two friends are just sort of concentrating on this game as they're playing, and you'll notice the concentration. This is all part of it, the broad-eyed concentration that they have. And they still both have, by the way, that hint of the archaic smile, even from profile. You can see the lines on the sides of their teeth, right, as they've got that brought into it, right? So they're playing this game highly concentrated because everybody knows the whole point of the story is that they get so concentrated in the game that they forget, right, to hear the initial call up to the war. So I've got 3 and 4. I had that nice detail in one I did. The shields have been set aside on either side, and both of them have grimacing faces on them with snakes and leopards. And there's every chance that these are meant to be references to Medusa, or at least the race that she came from. And they're painted or decorated on the outsides of the shields in order to ward off evil, right? We've talked about Medusa before. You remember that the statue that we saw from Knossos showed not only the snakes, but also the panther. There was on top of her head was a feline figure too. So those have now been translated into this work to show that that shield that he's put aside is something that's been decorated with elements that are meant to scare off the enemy, freeze them in their tracks. And again, that's that interplay between mythology and the physical world that for the Greeks was really strong. Now, we already mentioned what we know about Achilles. Notice how the artist has emphasized the heels. Look at how much attention has been given to the feet, and how Ajax's heel is in front of his stool, and Achilles, which will be his problem, right, is kind of hidden behind it. But there's these little subtle elements that point toward what the story is all about, because every Greek would have known exactly what happened because of this. And because of Achilles' heel, actually Achilles will die in battle because of that heel, right? Eventually he'll get the sword, the poisoned arrow exactly there. Someone will see his heel, and it will actually be his friend Ajax that's responsible for his death and feels responsible for it, right? And the Greeks would have known that. So what they're seeing here is not only this contemplated play between two friends, but this moment before the tragedy, and very much aware of the fact that these two guys are going from this downtime, this game, into battle, which will end in horrible tragedy, right? Didn't come in, Sarah. That's all right. Up in the Walters, we have sort of the, if you will, this is almost like the sequel to this, because this is now the battlefield. And there is Ajax here carrying the dead body of Achilles over his shoulder. And like I said, everybody that looked at our plots from Rome would have known that this was where it was headed. That Achilles will have to carry the dead body of his best friend off the battlefield, right? He didn't kill him. Did he? No, he didn't kill him. I think he was felt responsible for it, right? He allowed him to get killed. Do you know more? Do you know more about that? Right, but I think doesn't Ajax sort of feel like it was his fault, right? Not that he killed himself, but it was his fault. So he's now carrying on his best friend. If you go on the back of the Walters, there he is, right? So there's Ajax now carrying the dead Achilles. And you'll notice that it is interesting that the head of Achilles is ridiculous, right? There's Achilles' feet. There's his haunches back here. He's draped now over the shoulder of Ajax here. And his head ends up now behind that shield, right? You can't even see it. And what we end up seeing is just the eye of Ajax, right? And even though it looks very similar to the eyes we just saw, the other spot, you project into it because you know it's something that's now sad, right? Now it's a mournful eye. And then lastly, just so you know, on the other side of this plot, is the actual battle where Achilles is falling beneath the horses. As he died. So one of the things that we've been doing as we talk about these plots is using them not only to talk about Greek art and things that are stylistic, the importance of Greek art, but also to talk about these mythologies. I think for the Greeks, it was really important, these places where mythology and the supernatural world were intersected with the human world. That's really the case here. And what we find when we look at Greek plots of the 6th century is that the vast majority of them seem to focus on these places where we get that wonderful intersection between the heavens and the earth, right? And including Ajax this one. So Sarah is here now. I'm going to go over and get set up in the art. So when you're done here, come over and, make a wood block print. We'll have them, or lino block print. We'll have them and see what other departments are doing in the artscape and support that.